Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin wassalatu wassalamu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala asyrafil anbiya wal mursalin wa ala alihi wasahbihi ajma'in. Salam sejahtera. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to Malaysian Higher Education 4.0 webinar series. Today we have a title, Connectivism and Online Learning. Thank you so much for investing your time with us today. I hope today's event will make our day meaningful. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Zaida Taseh. I'm from University Technology Malaysia. I'll be responsible for moderating this webinar today, and I'm glad to welcome all of you in the Facebook and YouTube. Today, we have an outstanding speaker on connectivism and online learning, Professor George Siemens, where we'll be discussing about the contemporary learning theory, connectivism. This webinar is jointly organized by Education and Human Development Cluster, Academy of Professor Malaysia, and Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities, UTM. Before we start, I would like to invite Dr. Nakib to recite a dua.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya wal mursalin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Ya Allah, Ya Rahman, Ya Rahim. For all the benefits and blessings we have received, we can only express our gratitude to you. In conjunction with the webinar series entitled Connectivism and Online Learning today, we ask for your enlightenment, guidance and tawfiq. O Allah, please open our hearts and minds so that we can fill with knowledge, guidance, and wisdom. O Allah, we ask your blessing and grace for this event. May all our efforts in making this ceremony a success get rewarded from you. اللهم افتح علينا حكمتك وانشر علينا من خزائن رحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. صلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. الحمد لله رب العالمين.
Thank you, Dr. Nakib. Amin Ya Rabbal Alamin. Let me introduce a little bit about Academy of Professors Malaysia. Academy of Professors Malaysia is a think tank that combines expertise and mobilize the strategic thinkings of professors to develop the society. The Academy of Professors is an association which is academic driven, inclusive, includes professors from public and private university as well as from various fields of knowledge, independence without political intervention, equipped with high integrity, authoritative professionals, and practicing genuine academic freedom. Thus, the Academy of Professors will serve as an effective check and balance institutions for the formulations and implementations of government and state policies. So, ladies and gentlemen, so here is the format to give you an idea what to be expect for today's sessions. Today's session is being recorded to be available for viewing post-conference. We will take a few moments to briefly introduce the speaker and tell a little bit about his background. This session will be divided into three subsessions, and each subsession will take approximately around 20 to 30 minutes. And then at the end of every subsession, we will open up the floor to give you an opportunity to ask questions to the speaker. If you have any questions, please use the chat features in YouTube and Facebook. I believe it sounds good, and we are ready to start. Let us start by introducing the guest speaker. Professor George Siemens researched how humans and artificial cognition intersects in knowledge processes. He co-leads the Center for Change and Complexity in Learning at University of South Australia and is a professor at University of Texas, Arlington. He has delivered keynote address in more than 40 countries on the influence of technology and media on educations, organizations, and society. His work has been profiled in provincial, national, and international newspapers, including New York Times, radios, and television. He has served as a principal investigator or co-principal investigator on grants funded by NSF, SSHRC Canada, OLT from Australia, Intel, Boeing, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundations, and the Soros Foundations. He has received numerous awards, including honorary doctorates from Universidad de San Martin de Porres and Fraser Valley University for his pioneering works in learning, technology, and networks. He holds an honorary professorship with University of Edinburgh. Dr. Siemens is a founding president of the Societies for Learning Analytics Research. He has advised governments agencies such as Australia, European Unions, Canada, and United States, as well as numerous international universities on digital learning and utilizing learning analytics for assessing and evaluating productivity gains in the education sector and improving learner results. In 2008, he pioneered massive open online courses that we refer as MOOCs. So, ladies and gentlemen, please give a big round of applause to Facebook, like for us to invite our speaker, Professor George Siemens, to discuss on the first point of today's session, which is actually on introductions to connectivism versus other learning theory, and how do Professor Siemens end up with the formulating connectivism. Josh, Professor Siemens, welcome to the stage. How are you, Josh? You are muted, Josh.
There we go. You have to start. You have to start with getting muting wrong, right?
Yeah.
So hopefully you see the screen now with the slide. Thank you very much for the invitation, and I appreciate the opportunity to spend a bit of time with you. As I stated just before when we were talking, I've been to Malaysia a few times, and I've absolutely loved every visit. And I hope that once things return a little bit more back to normal, that I'll have an opportunity to visit again. I've been asked to talk about three specific things. The first section, I'll talk just generally about connectivism and online learning. I won't go into great detail about the online aspect. I think that part is actually a little bit more self-explanatory. Then I'll turn and I'll spend some time looking at connectivism in terms of its application in online learning, which is sort of the second part of the talk. I have a number of slides to go through there. The first section is about 30 some slides. The second section is a little bit closer to 20 slides, and then the final section I'll look at the future of connectivism and online learning, and I've got about another 25 slides there, just so in case anyone's keeping track. Altogether there's about 75 slides that I'll go through today, and I'll pause after about 20 to 30 minutes for questions at each stage. So one of the, by way of background, and I'll tell you a quick background story and then I'll get into the actual slide. So it was in about 2002, 2003, I was taking a series of courses that just looked at digital learning and digital technologies and the effect that these technologies might have on learning. And one of the courses that I was taking and the text that I was working through was Margaret Driscoll's text that looked at the psychology of learning, which still remains one of the more enjoyable texts in this area. And I found it fascinating to see how different individuals had traditionally seen learning and models of learning. And it varied quite a bit from my experience that I had. I was at that point, like many of my peers, working online, starting to learn from resources that were readily available through digital technologies, and having the opportunity to come across just fascinating resources from people from around the world. And these people were often, brilliant researchers, they were brilliant academics, and they were writing blog posts. This was before social media like Twitter and Facebook. But in early 2000, there was this very rich ecosystem of people sharing ideas and resources. And at that point, I started to become quite interested in what is it about this style of learning that's not being addressed by some of the existing theories of knowledge? And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So for the first section, I'll kind of move in between the history of the technology as it developed at the time, and then some commentary on where the network models of connectivism came in. So to start with, I'm going to go run through these six stages of technology. What happened just before the web, early web, Web 2.0, then media-rich, immersive, and then now where we're increasingly starting to pay attention to sort of AI-infused learning. So with the early stages, before the internet was prominent, there was already digital learning happening. This was in the form of computer-based training, which a lot of companies were using. I used to do training with DVDs and laser discs more accurately within a number of corporate settings. And these were good opportunities for people to just learn in a media-rich way. This was often self-contained learning, but there wasn't much connectedness. And so what I mean with that is you would engage in this learning process. While you were engaged, you wouldn't be connected to anyone on the internet. You couldn't share your resources, or you couldn't discuss some of the things that you were doing. This was a heavily individual learning experience, but computers were already involved in that process. Then in early 2000, well, probably late 1990s, WebCT started. Early 2000, Blackboard and Moodle started, and these were basically learning management systems that duplicated what we already did on the internet, or what we already were doing in classrooms, I should say. So they used similar technology, similar words, and similar language. There was a classroom, there was a discussion area, files were made available, and so in many cases, there was still a very curriculum-heavy approach to learning. Access was made available through these digital tool sets, and in many cases, it represented a significant advancement for teaching and learning with technology. But the reality of it is we really haven't moved terribly far past this model. And if you look at what happened in the rise of COVID in probably about 18 months ago now, in early 2000, when universities suddenly moved online, they still used a lot of the similar technologies. And by similar technologies, I mean they still moved online quite aggressively with different kinds of tool sets, different kinds of classroom controlled perspectives that were still heavily favoring the instructor. So the instructor was still central in the learning experience, and it was mainly a transition of media. Instead of in person, it was online. Then an interesting stage happened, and I still think this is one of the most consequential parts of learning historically. And it's something that I don't think the education system has absorbed yet. I think we're still dealing with the effects of this. And that's this idea of Web 2.0. And Web 2.0 basically reflected this early stage where we had a shift from sort of who had control. And as I note at the bottom of the slide here, it was everyone had a voice, anyone could share. And this was where networks really started making an impact on the overall experience of learning. It was defined by openness. There was a lot of socialization. We were connecting with peers from around the world. And these networks connected communities of learners in different regions, even within the same institution, but across classrooms that might have in the past been boundaried with physical walls. And I have a few slides a little bit later that'll address some of these transitions and what it produced. And the tools at the time, and I emphasize again, I don't think we have absorbed the lesson of Web 2.0 in our education system yet. We're still trying to work our way through what that was. But it was Twitter, Second Life, Delicious, as a social bookmarking, blogs, and so on. So a number of really fascinating tools and technologies. Then we had an interesting stage start to emerge. It produced YouTube and media sharing, or rich media tools. Now, obviously, TikTok and a range of other tools fit in that vein. And we also had at that stage the first attempt of MOOCs, or massive open online courses, heavily video-based, but quite instructivist. And this was often defined by a bit of a change from the social learning aspect we had with the first set of MOOCs from Stanford and Harvard and MIT, actually take a step back. And what I mean a step back was it was a reversal of some of the social network learning that had arisen, and it resulted in a range of good quality learning experiences for people from around the world, but it replicated the traditional classroom. Now, there's a few other areas I'll just touch on a little bit, or the final two, I should say. One is immersive learning. This is anything from a virtual reality, augmented or artificial reality kind of environments. Could be game-based. If you have young children, they're likely playing Minecraft or some similar type of immersive game. Unfortunately, the adoption in education was limited because it's quite expensive to develop and quite difficult to run, but there's high prospect for engagement. At the same time, and this is the area where most of my current interest is in, which I'll address in subsequent slides, is the role of artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence right now has a lot of hype to it, but it's already in the background of a lot of tools that we're using. It's not changing the world the way that pundits have initially said, but it's definitely helping to set the foundation for what I think will be a very substantial change in how we learn and how we interact with one another. There's a few related technologies that are just worth emphasizing. They're based on some of the tools I just talked about, but if this then that, which provides information management control to an end user. There's all the work around blockchain credentials or micro-credentialing, which has a significant interest in a number of clusters, even though it's not as broadly activated an interest as we hoped for a period. Almost everything is cloud-based now. Many of you may have started working with a learning management system that was hosted by your university, but now, if you're like most universities, you probably have a cloud-based provider such as Blackboard or Instructure or Canvas or Brightspace that's doing that. There's more attention being paid to profile management and different tool sets to help make the learning process more effective, as well as manage data, and then a growing interest to adaptive or personalized learning, some of which, such as Newton, aren't as prominent as they once was, but others that continue to grow in influence and effect. So here's where the challenge arises, though. So now you have this range of tools and this range of technologies that are available to individuals. They have much greater control over their learning than they've ever had. If you're teaching a course at any level, from a bachelor's through to graduate, through to postgraduate, they have control over their learning. If you're teaching statistics, or if you're teaching religious studies, or if you're teaching gender studies, your students are finding resources outside of the classroom that you aren't teaching them. And in some cases, that can actually be different from what you're teaching in that classroom. This produces two problems. One is you have this idea of knowledge fragmentation, and the other is this lack of coherence of understanding. So what we're doing is, when we take the basic unit of education from courses and workshops or modules down to individual learning that you Google, or resources that you find, or a short 2-hour module or video lecture that you listen to, or a tutorial that you see on some aspect of a technology that you want to learn how to use, you end up with this fragmentation problem where we have a lack of coherence and we don't quite know what it is that our students know or what our students understand. And so the challenge, and I'll talk about this in just a second, is when these content pieces aren't brought together into a coherent whole by the faculty member or by an expert in the field, we need to give our students the skill sets to try and pull some of this together so that they can act in a meaningful way. Now, here are a few examples of where this has not worked well in a number of settings. So one was this idea of the illusion of explanatory depth, which came from a paper where a psychologist in UK asked students to define or describe how basic tools that they likely use every day work. And overwhelmingly, the students were unable to describe what it is that they were, or how they worked, or what they did. So here's an example of individuals drawing how a bicycle works. And as you can tell, there's some really fascinating examples of how bicycles work. Now, what's happening is students are learning and they're repeating content back to a teacher, but they're not understanding what they've been taught. So even before we had this fragmentary internet producing smaller and smaller chunks of knowledge that needed to be stitched back together, we already had students and individuals being unable to pull those pieces together in a meaningful way, which meant that we had a system that wasn't preparing our students. Another example is the MIT light bulb, where MIT students were unable to communicate how a bulb and a battery and a wire would coordinate to light the bulb. And this is something that you think would be a pretty basic idea, but unfortunately it's not. And I emphasize that because, again, we have this fragmentary knowledge system, and this is critical. We have a method of instruction, could be lecture, could be self-related learning, but we have a method of instruction and learning that is not meeting the needs that would require core understanding in a particular domain. Another illustration is Harvard had a group of students that were interviewed, why do we have seasons? And they ended up having the vast majority of graduates of the top university in the world being unable to describe seasons and how it is that seasons actually work. So that's a significant problem, and it means that there's some issues that we need to address or better solve in the education system. Now, in order to respond to this, there have been a number of individuals traditionally who've tried to create views or models of learning or theories of learning. So we've had some, such as, that take the distributed model, like Hutchins. Learning doesn't just occur in the skull, it occurs in the world around us, which also relates to Wittgenstein and Vygotsky and some recent theorists that look at embodied cognition as well. You look at others that Spivey that talks about it doesn't always happen in the brain, or Breider calls it knowing outside the mind. We've had individuals or theorists such as Wittgenstein, who's more of a philosopher, Vygotsky, who you're probably mostly aware of is a learning theorist or psychologist. They emphasize externalization, and that we exist for the social cultural world of artifacts, where artifacts that have been created bear with them some culture values that get passed on to us as we use them. Then we had a large number of theorists that have come by, from Papert to Piaget, Brunner, and Bandura, that emphasize social learning and the social dimension of learning. And that has a significant effect. And I think in many cases, the development of constructivist and social constructivist learning sits in this particular domain, though it has some overlap with those that advocate for ethical or moral structures of learning. Individuals like Freire and Illich, or even Papert and Dewey, that emphasize that there is more of an intent for education to produce or create depth of understanding of our role in a moral society. Now, in 2004, I posited that maybe connectivism, or this idea of connections as being primal in this process, is how we needed to see things. And that was the intent of the theory of connectivism. And basically, I'll start by talking about it a little bit, and then I'll take a slightly more complex run into this idea of cognition and artificial cognition, tying it back to the AI discussion. But with connectivism, the general view is that knowledge is networked and it's distributed. It's distributed across people, it's distributed across artifacts, and when we access and interact with it, the act of learning is where we form new neuroconceptual and external networks. This is particularly accurate in the case of complex, chaotic, and shifting spaces of knowledge, meaning it's domains where there's a lot of new information being developed very rapidly, and increasingly this process is aided by technology or even by artificial intelligence. So essentially, connectivism then is advanced as a theory of learning and a theory of knowledge. Now, this happens at the number of distinct levels, where as we grow and prune these networks, it occurs at the individual, team, organizational, domain, and societal level. So the cultural component can't be eliminated. When we apply it to an individual, though, it happens at three distinct levels. Neuronally, which is literally our brains are forming and connecting and making connections. Conceptually, where we're connecting ideas to other ideas, and externally, where we start to rely on tools and technology to make that happen more accurately. Now, at some level, this is starting to be aided increasingly by AI and AI systems. And so at a level of neurons working and firing, at a level of memory being networked and overlapping, in fact, when we recall an event, we move through our memory structure almost in a physical way that allows us to recall. One illustration, they would have individuals look at a map and they would have different figures on the map. Then they would calculate response time. So let's say at the top of the map, you had a tree, and at the bottom of the map, you had a house. If you ask them to, and then beside the tree, let's say you had a lake. If you ask them to say tree and then identify a lake, the response time was shorter because they were physically moving from the tree to the lake. But if you ask them to move from the tree to the house, which there was greater distance on the map, there was a longer response time. So we're moving through these networks even when we're thinking and interacting and recalling. And so in this regard, this knowledge aspect is held in this distributed system of neuronal activation. Now, some have called this idea of, this notion of generalized intelligence that allows us to move across these different networks or these different spaces. But there's domain-specific work, and there's specific abilities at an individual level where this holds true. So what we're looking at is, what are the connectivist attributes of moving from a neuronal to a conceptual to an external network? What are the attributes that exist the same across those networks when we're connecting, much like this Spearman's or this generalized type of intelligence? Now, when we apply this to a theory of neuroscience, there is a view of human intelligence that is based on a comparable type of a network or a connectivist structure. And so ultimately, the point I'm trying to get to here is that at a neuronal level and at an external level, we are dealing with connections and models of connections and how we move through those connections. These things happen at a basic biological level, such as in our brain, but it also happens how curriculum is created in a university. If you want to learn statistics, if you want to learn the history of Malaysia, if you want to learn international politics, you're taking conceptual ideas and connecting them to other known conceptual ideas. And then finally on this topic, we also have this idea that external systems influence what we're doing, which means that there is knowledge that exists in organizations. And when we access other parts of the organization, we have access to those kinds of knowledge or that kind of information. Now, what happens here, and I'm going to wrap this up in about the next 5 or 6 slides, but this section at least. But what happens here is that we are now involved in artificial cognition being part of the human knowledge network. And so in the past, we've always had this view that what we're learning and what we're doing is sort of unique to humans, but that's changing. And increasingly that now involves AI or our systems, and we have to acclimate to it. When you consider, and I use the word human and artificial cognition, meaning that we're thinking together with technology. Technology isn't a tool that we use so much as it's a partner that we work with. And so in a number of knowledge-based settings, whether it's a company deciding to invest in robots on a factory floor, whether it's you with your friends deciding to go out for dinner and you're using an app to determine what's the best place to go eat, or whether it's looking at who you follow on social media, and the list goes on, you're involved in a constant process where artificial cognition impacts or influences our actual decision making. And that has significant implications for the future of the school system. And the key emphasis then is, how is this AI model different from traditional technology advancement? And my argument is, at the core, this AI advancement is one where we're moving from technology as a tool to technology as a quasi-colleague. Namely, it's a tool that we think with and something that we interact with. So these algorithms, these robots, these AI models are part of our cognitive system. These are essentially then agents that think with us, not agents that we use to think. And then just a final point on this, what I mean from a cognitive perspective, and I'll flesh this out in the next slide a little bit, is we're basically, with cognition, when I'm talking cognition, I'm looking at the sensory processes, mental operations, and complex integrated activities that are activated when we move and engage with information in a meaningful way. A lot of these things can be done through artificial intelligence. And so if you look at the Electronic Freedom Foundation has an AI progress index, and a number of things such as sensory processes, AI can outperform human beings at a significant level. It can outperform us in many mental operations. We're still a bit unique in complex integrated activities, but nonetheless, we are ceding greater and greater percentage of our human cognitive work to these AI systems. So the final thing to wrap up this slide before I pause for questions is a quick summary then. So with connectivism, the domains that I'm looking at, if you look at the left side of your screen, are biological, conceptual, and external. There are different models and units that we're looking at, different academic domains that look at it. So the model for biological is the brain, conceptual is the mind, external is the body, or the units could be neurons, ideas, or AI agents, or people as agents. And then, of course, there's a number of academic domains from psychology to neuroscience to philosophy to computer science to sociology. So I'm going to pause there and see if there's any questions that have arisen, and then I will resume.
Yeah, thank you, George. Very interesting, I think, point about our connectivism. I think we have one question from Facebook. Okay, with reference to your statement earlier, reducing the basic units of education from courses, workshop module to competency, can we anticipate a change of the way university will offer courses? Perhaps will university reduce courses and put more focus on competency to embrace and make graduates qualified for a job that's suitable at that time? Competency based will take less time, perhaps 3 weeks to 2 months. This can also affect university income as well. Can you please comment on it? Okay.
I think we can. I think we see some universities doing it already. They're offering shorter courses. You see a lot of different types of MOOC providers are offering 2-week courses, 3-week courses, and so on. So there's a lot of work that's already being done in this area. I've seen some universities, whether it's through boot camps as an example, that has gained a fair bit of attention. Others have tried to turn a little bit more toward the use of you know, block curriculum, I think, is one example that's been used. So rather than taking one set of courses over a number of months, you have a very tight set of courses that you're teaching in a unit of, say, a few weeks rather than over 16 weeks. So I know there's a lot of universities that are playing around with how you might do a better job of curriculum in short courses. But I do think the idea of a 16-week course is one that probably should be revisited. And there has been some work in the US, at least, around, competency-based learning and stuff like that gained a fair bit of attention a number of years ago. 20 years ago, we used to call it recognition of prior learning and assessment. And so there's a number of models that people have used before. So I do think there's there's still a good degree of interest in it. But universities are a little slow to change because our curriculum model is quite restrictive, and it's restrictive for a reason, right? We've been mandated by the state or by the government to teach certain materials to prepare certain people for the labor market, and so we haven't been very quick to adjust. So, for example, it took me 4.5 years at University of Texas in Arlington to develop a Master's of Science in Learning Analytics. We just launched in August. We have another intake coming in January, but that's a long time to develop a master's. So from that end, I'm a little concerned about how long that takes. Then I was reading yesterday that Google is now launching a set of free courses to teach 40 million people how to use the Google services, and that's available online in shorter courses than what we're offering in university. So I hope universities start taking these different kinds of formats more seriously, because there's a lot of room for us to do better and to match the needs of learners rather than what our system requirements are.
Okay, I'm actually when I heard that you took about 4.5 years to change and to offer this kind of a program in University of Texas Arlington. Then we face, I think, quite same problem, because due to of course the mindsets of I think the ministry and the professors also, because we used to the conventional curriculums where we have course what I call it 16 weeks, 14 weeks lectures and everything. Okay. Do we have other questions in Facebook or YouTube? If not, I just want to ask you, Josh, on it looks like when you actually explain on the connectivism, I can see that you are combining the neuroscience perspective, okay, neuroscience perspective of how people learns, and also a little bit on looking on AI perspective, how AI be smarter, is so smart than us, and so on. And it looks like through connectivism we might going to actually produce graduates who might be on par with the structures of how AI works and so on. What are your comments on it?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, when you think of it at a basic level, learning is connection forming. From the time we're children, we, even things like the scientific method is about connection forming. Does this cause this effect? And so we learn that we learn relationships is maybe another way of saying it when we're involved in that kind of activity. The same is true when we're learning in courses or when we're learning in a university setting. We are engaged in trying to understand how pieces fit and what the relationship is from one idea to the next idea. What's unique now is at a basic level, and I said this occurs at 3 levels. There's the biological, which is the neuroscience. There's the conceptual, which is more the theory of mind and how we connect and relate ideas to each other. And then there's the external, which is, very much involved, or will, I think, increasingly involve AI, chatbots or support resources. We already have it. I mean, anybody who has a phone deals with this every day, all day. You're interacting with an information sourcing agent that presents information in social networks and connection to you on Twitter or social media or whatever, that people you should follow and so on. So yes, I think AI, neuroscience, learning, education, psychology, learning sciences, that little cluster of concepts and fields of research has, I think, a really substantial opportunity moving forward for rapid advancement and deep insights into sort of the human experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Now we have one questions from the Facebook. If we treat AI and technology as a tool, should we be concerned on the depths of knowledge comprehensions of our younger generation?
I think so. We've always been concerned. My parents were concerned about the depth of my knowledge. I've been concerned about the depth of my kids' knowledge. For people as grandkids come along, people will be worried about the depth of their knowledge. What's unique today, though, I think, and it's worrying, is do people understand the depth of let me try again. Do people know things at a deep level? Rather than just a very quick, sort of superficial way of interacting. We can quickly Google something, but there's no indication that actually means that we understand it. There's been a number of papers, books even, that have been written around exactly this topic. What does it mean to understand something deeply? And can in a generation that's used to very quick fire, high visual social media, such as YouTube and playing in developed online worlds that they build and create, and now with TikTok and Snapchat, are they learning to understand things at a deep level? And so I think that remains to be a really important question that we should focus on. Now, one thing that's a little different is I think I treat AI less like a tool now and more like an agent that thinks with us. It's making decisions on our behalf. When I log on to Twitter or social media, it shows me certain sources of information based on what I've done in the past. When I log on to YouTube or any of these other tools, it's the same kind of an effect. And it's a little worrying on some levels, right? That it's giving us this very specific or very structured kind of an approach. So we do need to do a better job, I think, of being able to articulate what that actually looks like in the long run, for us to teach people to understand things at a deep level, but also to be aware that AI is actively influencing the information that we see and is actively producing a bit of an echo chamber in some cases.
Yeah, that's true. I believe we need checks and balance on the knowledge and also on the environments that we face nowadays, because this is actually 21st century. I think even the technology also affecting the brain, the structures of the brain. Yeah. So we have another
Absolutely.
question. Yeah. If university focus on more on competency based courses and many students enroll because of the attractiveness, how to ensure the quality? In other words, how will be the assessment be taken care? What about the opinions and standard of ABET and Washington Accord? You know what? In higher ed, assessment is such an issue among the professors. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Well, for those of you that have spent time looking at things like prior learning assessment and recognition, those of you that are, have started to explore automated assessment and models of automating assessment, I think there's quite a bit of work that's already going on. I think that has really strong potential to guide how we do that kind of work. And by that, I'm talking about things like automating the grading mechanisms, providing adaptive support to individuals. If there's ways that we can take competency-based assessment models, such as triangulating evidence and so on, I think there's a lot of potential there. We can also emphasize peer-based learning and peer-based assessment. You don't have to be the person that has to sort of drive everything and make everything work. Like as a teacher, you can rely on individuals to do some of that assessment as well. So there's a number of ways I think that we can get around it, or at least support it. But I do think we will find more and more automated assessment is going to be a greater part of the overall learning experience in almost every university or classroom setting.
Yeah, thank you, Josh. Do we have other question from Facebook or YouTube? Yeah, another one is that short courses, micro credentials may serve to connect people more in learning, extend education. The concern may be on how institution could train those people to stage those micro credentials together. Wow, very interesting question.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's our problem. Like, I don't know. I do think it's important. I do think there are ways that we need to do a better job of addressing that. We're not doing it right now. We are letting students come into our courses with a lot of biases, with a lot of different perspectives. We haven't developed the capabilities of our students to be able to evaluate bias, to be able to self-reflect and understand what it is that they know or what it is that they don't know. And so at some point, the question becomes, what are the skills that we need individual students to have that will enable them to be effective learners in this kind of a large-scale digital setting, where they're going to encounter a lot of false information, inaccurate information. In some cases, it's intentionally inaccurate, right? Like people, state level actors in some cases that are trying to promote or drive propaganda, may be contributing to possible outcomes or possible assessment metrics that we need to be more cautious of. So how we train individuals to stitch together knowledge across these different domains is, I think, quite a consequential problem that the university sector faces.
Yeah. Might be one question that we should actually ask also is that, do we need to stage all the micro credential together to form one, I think, subjects or courses that we have right now, or it might be just a pieces of knowledge when you need it when you're going to go for the workplace later on. I think this is another thing that we should think about it. Whether we need to stage them together, or indirectly in solving the real world problem, you need that to be stitched together by understanding how can you use that knowledge from each micro credential. So do we have any other questions from Facebook and YouTube? If not, we will move to the second subsection, Josh. So if you can share with us on might be some examples of applications of connectivism in online learning or in teaching and learning, Josh. Okay.
Sure. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of, more conceptual overviews than necessarily specific examples. But and so one way to look at this is the effect that, and really what we're experiencing at a classroom level and have been for a long time. But we're seeing a move from these traditional structures of knowledge and information. It could be textbooks or books, university degrees, courses, and so on. And we're seeing them move to networks. We just talked micro-credentialing, but it could be stackable degrees. It could be micro-masters. There's all kinds of initiatives that are now emerging, often driven by either a for-profit or a related sector, that are focusing on how to make this experience of learning more like networks. And there's a number of examples from different areas that, how companies were built in the past. So, in the past, a company would create everything. And companies like Boeing with the 787 came by and created a global supply chain. Even now, one of the things that's getting a lot of attention, at least in the US and Canada and those parts of the world, is the global supply chain, where everything is readily accessible in a pretty short period of time. And so as a result of that, we are used to having everything at our fingertips, but we don't know, or we aren't often aware that there's this huge global network of people and organizations that are pulling resources together and so on. And so these networks function differently. And so when it used to be, if you built an airplane at Boeing, everything was built in that one area. When they started with the 787, they had hundreds of partners globally that were each contributing different parts of the plane, and it was all brought together and locally assembled. In the past, we'd have a corporation that was largely centralized. Everything happened within a particular location, often a geographical location, but now it requires coordination from around the world. These companies are often built to last or built for stability, and now they're built to move quickly, right? So you want a company that can respond rapidly to new trends or to new things that are impacting society. Similarly, whereas in the past it might have been set, being efficient was a key goal by generating revenue and profit. Now flexibility is a key goal. How quickly can you move and how rapidly can you adjust? We also had, and this has potentially negative effects, but this idea of you would often have people that had a job for life. And now this job is frequently for the duration of a task. There's a lot of, the gig economy gets a lot of recognition this way, but it's just this sense that there is continual ongoing effects that require us to adjust and adapt. And it produces stress and insecurity in the part of the workforce, and you're now starting to see that emerge in the US, where there's far more attention being paid to the global effects of this type of insecurity and the psychological effects of it. So I do expect we're going to continue to see a greater number of, we'll call it, social uprisings or things that are upsetting and impacting society in general. And we're certainly seeing it emerge in the US and in Canada. Now, one way that universities have, or an approach for universities to respond, getting back to this idea of what are some of the applications, was to move into the digital space. So that's been a key issue for universities to start to basically become digital organizations. But as I mentioned, it took me a long time to develop a basic Master of Science in Learning Analytics. So you need to find a way to make this more effective and more impactful. And so universities that were slow to adopt new technologies, in 2000, had to go with integrated partners like edX or 2U. It could be academic partnerships and a number of others that have come up that integrate these entire ecosystems. And they do it end to end. So you start with one end, you move right to the end. It's all, they do everything to help universities succeed, including the marketing and the promotion. Others have started with partnerships. So instead, and there's an interesting diagram that came out a while ago that looked at Harvard and the hundreds of companies that now support Harvard, from testing to teaching to learning content to assessment to credentialing and so on. And so in this case, a university still stitches everything together, but they do a lot of outsourcing. Some groups, and this happened recently with Arizona University, or University of Arizona, where they bought a separate group or company, and Purdue did this as well, but they buy separate legal entities that then help manage or work, do their activity online. And in some cases, it's external organizations where you have arrangements with capacity providers. This is similar to integrated, such as with 2U, but with external, it's basically working with the consulting firms or related agents. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up here is when we're talking, the solution really to the complex challenges that we face is for universities to get into digital spaces, to start to work and to function within networks. The problem, though, is that as they're involved in these networks, they lose some of their control, and they need additional capabilities, often have to reach out and partner with other groups in order to make it happen. There's an important concept I want to emphasize here, which is called latency. And a lot of systems have what I'll call latent capacity, and that's capacity that exists that's not being used. Some of the major companies that we see today, especially those that support the gig economy, are of this type. So what they've done is they have, let's say your house has a latent occupancy capacity. You are there for X number of months a year. You might have, let's say, a summer home, or you might just travel a lot. But when you're not there, that's unused capacity in your house. Now, a company like Airbnb came along and said, oh, you know what? We can help activate that latent capacity. The same thing happens with, say, cars, and companies like Uber came along and said, hey, we can help with that. Or you could use Facebook, where we had a lot of latent, unrealized potential to connect and interact with others, and Facebook and Twitter enabled that latent capacity. One of the things that we haven't seen in education is tools that activate that kind of latent knowledge capabilities. I think there's a lot of potential and a lot of opportunities for that to be done by schools and universities, meaning there's no reason why students can't teach one another. Like with one of the earlier questions, there's no reason why students can't even assess one another. There's no reason why some of the credentialing can't be handled by non-formal agents. It could be industry or other areas. So basically, broadly speaking, in terms of teaching, in terms of learning, and in terms of assessment, we haven't yet had those latency activating tools created for the education sector. We've taken a number of tools from a number of different industries. We use Google and Microsoft, and we use a number of related tools that help us be productive, but they're not unique to the education sector. There's a few, such as Coursera, that have come along to help do a better job with a teaching aspect, but it doesn't address the idea that there is significant latent capacity in our society that allows us all to be teachers and us all to be learners. Now, some have tried to create tools like this where we can teach everyone, but they really haven't made the ease of use a compelling argument for people to use or to work with. Now, here's why that's important. So if you see that middle group on your screen, or the middle part, this is a very traditional model of education. This is what we've had for hundreds of years. We have faculty, then we have core content. It could be a textbook, it could be curriculum, it could be lectures, and then that's communicated to the learner. The learner, though, is the latent capacity owner in this instance, because the learner can teach, the learner can learn, the learner can assess. There's a lot that they can do beyond what they're being asked to do in a traditional system. In fact, it can look a lot like this. There's content that's been co-created. There's external experts that can come in. There's open educational resources that can be accessed, peripheral learners in other parts of the world, and so on. So the real goal is, in order to take a connectivist model of learning, is to activate this kind of latent capacity that learners have to grow and to understand and to make sense of these complex areas of interaction. Another way to look at it is traditional courses are created for, you have the lecture, the content, activities, assessment, and then finally some kind of a credential. Whereas if you're taking a connectivist course or connective learning experience, you can work through it on your own. You can interact with peers. You can even take a formal course, then come back to an informal course, and so on. So there's this experience of very active, ongoing engagement in these kinds of environments that place a lot of emphasis on the students to be a more active owner of her learning, or a more active, engaged participant in what they end up learning. Now, the reason why I say this is significant is because it changes our relationship to our education institutions. Now, let me give you an example of what I mean with that. Here's a number of, we'll call them learning and knowledge frameworks. There's daily sense making. There's crisis. We have a significant challenge that exists. Now it would be COVID, not SARS. There's new knowledge, such as research and new technology. And then there's mapping to existing knowledge, which is more formal learning courses and so on. Our current education system is more geared toward these two quadrants. It's geared towards what do we know and then teaching it to someone, or how to make sense of their sort of daily lives. But much of our modern society actually exists here. The future of our society, the future of work is here. Many of us today are using completely different tools than we used even 5 years ago. Many of us are now able to, if we want to learn a simple concept in statistics, we can quickly Google it or search it and find an answer to it. And so we're involved in these experiences where we are working in areas where there aren't right answers yet. There's a lot of chaos. There's a lot of things emerging and developing quickly, and that's producing a fairly uneven and a fairly complex kind of a knowledge output. Now, I think I'll pause there before I go on to the final section on the future of connectivism. But for now, I want to emphasize that this is the problem, that we have a knowledge system that is not a knowledge system as the university. We have universities that are not aligned to the knowledge needs of a modern generation. They're not aligned in terms of the type of content that they teach. They're not aligned in terms of the type of learning needs that they have. They're not aligned to essentially the affordances and the opportunities that networks make available to them. And so when we're talking about application, there's a huge range of possible opportunities to do. And I'll mention a couple quickly before I pause. One, we did a project with a group of schools in South Australia called Epic Challenges. And this was based on a NASA model. We had an astronaut from NASA join us, and we would ask students, rather than tell them the curriculum, we would ask them, what is it that they would like to know? Or we would present a problem to them, such as, how would you sustain life on Mars? And then instead of giving the students the answer, we let them go out and find the answer. And they did. They would find fantastically insightful and creative ideas in response to this problem. Another project that we did was with a group called Smart Sparrow. And Smart Sparrow was a personalized adaptive learning system that has since been bought by Pearson, I believe. And what Smart Sparrow did was they would go out and, instead of giving course-based models, they would instead tell people, here's the thing that you need to know. Like, are we alone in the universe? And in order to answer that question, students would need to interact with a lot of different ideas. They would need to interact with concepts such as biology. They would need to interact with chemistry. They would need to interact with geology. They would have to work across a lot of these academic domains in order to answer this type of a question. Are we alone? And so those are examples that to me are inherently networked and inherently connectivist approaches to learning where students have to solve complex problems. They have to use their own resources, their own creativity. They have to build networks. They have to explore concepts, create and connect them in order to solve a particular challenge. And increasingly, like I said, they sit into this space on your right, namely these areas where things are changing rapidly, new knowledge is needed, even crises are emerging regularly. So I'll pause here before I go to the last section to talk sort of about the future of connectivism.
Thank you, George. So I'm wondering that when you discuss on the mismatch of what the university actually deliver or share on teaching and learning and knowledge to the students, and the futures of work is actually looking at the crisis, new knowledge. Uh, I believe we know about this, I think 20 years ago, 30 years ago, but what are the challenges actually to convince our colleagues in higher eds that we should actually change and look into delivering knowledge, not based on what we have right now on the conventional curriculums and so on, but looking at what the future works, we call it needed and aspects that our graduates should have, that kinds of skills and knowledge. What are the challenges,
Yeah.
Josh?
Well, I think one of the challenges is that a lot of people who are educators or even school leaders or university leaders, they didn't use these tools when they were younger. And so they don't understand quite how these tools work. So I think one of the first challenges that exists is and you'll see this whenever you have a project or a team where you have new or younger staff or younger researchers involved, they'll bring in new tools. They'll start to share or collaborate in a networked way. So I think that's the first problem or the first challenge, I think, is getting leaders to actually be familiar with these kinds of tools and giving them lived experiences with how to do it. The other ones are, having, there's a capability component to it as well. We recently did an analysis of the 10 highest performing school systems in the world. And we wanted to look at what made them so effective or what made them work well. And in many of them, they provided really good support for capability development for their teachers. And so what I mean by that is they made sure that their teachers knew how to use the technology. They knew how to deploy innovative pedagogies. You can't do a teacher and say, hey, practice a connectivist model of learning without giving that teacher support, without giving them the knowledge on how to use technology, how to teach in this way, how to support students, and so on. So I think in a lot of cases, that's a key issue that needs to be addressed, which is, how do you develop the capabilities in your workforce? This is technical, but also conceptual. I think learning to use a new tool is easier to do than learning how to adopt a new pedagogy or a new model of teaching and learning.
Thank you, Josh, meaning that leaders and also support on the capability development.
Yes.
Okay. We have questions from the Facebook saying that employers are constantly lamenting our graduates are lacking in generic skill. How can university teach these skills in virtual learning environments? How to measure and certify them? Please share your opinion. Yeah.
That's a great question. There's a lot of research going on in this area, especially in learning analytics or educational data mining or some of these related fields. And what I mean by a lot of research is that these are areas where people are paying a lot of attention to how do you assess general skills, or how do you assess even more broadly what's now called sort of future-oriented skills or social and emotional learning, or these kinds of skills that we just need to be successful, especially if technology is a growing influence in our daily lives. What are the skills that we need to be successful going forward? Like, what are our skills that are critical for tomorrow? And so as a result of that angle, I think There's promising work being done, but really no clear answers, especially how to measure and certify. How do you measure and certify someone who's a good team player? How do you measure and certify someone who has a good attitude when they're working through complex problems? So those are hard things to do. We did a special issue a number of years ago, about 2 years ago, for the Journal for Learning Analytics, where we looked at social and emotional learning, because a lot of those fit into the idea of generic skills, but there's a number of words that use to describe them, 21st century skills, future workforce skills, and so on. There's different words used to describe it, but all of them, I think, share that same problem. In the past, the apprenticeship model was actually very good for exactly assessing those skills. Because what would happen with an apprentice model, I would work with my, the person, the plumber or the stone cutter or, whoever it was, and I would spend time with him. And over time, I would learn, I would observe, and I would get feedback regularly, how to do it, how to do this, how to do that. And that would help me become better able to incorporate and adapt some of those capabilities into my own practices and my own habits. As a result of doing that, we gain deeper and more informed insight, because the apprentice would receive direct feedback and ongoing input. And so in the apprenticeship model, we have that kind of one-to-one relationship from the expert to the apprentice. And we develop those generic skills by, you teach them, you can't do this, you need to do it this way, you need to interact with people this way. The difficulty we have now is that our current system often doesn't have a tight enough teacher to student relationship to assess generic skills well. And that's why sometimes we maybe need to rely a little bit more on peer-based assessment, because peer-based assessment can give us a slightly better understanding of, what someone knows or what they might need to know in order to continue to be productive. But I do think there's active work being done around generic skills assessment. The World Economic Forum has listed their future job skills. OECD has done something similar. And they're trying to create models that will, in the long run, allow us to assess or evaluate exactly what those skills are. But it's a good question, because we're not there right now at a way that we can do it at scale. We can still do it through human observation, but to do it through any kind of an automated way or a peer-based way requires slightly more development.
Yeah. Another things, I think there is actually transformation also on the generic skills, because when everything is go online, this is where we can see that there's so many online generic skills are being measured right now, like online critical thinking, online creative thinking. How do you actually criticize something, make an online argument, and this is actually the area that have been, I think, not new, actually has been explored by the previous researcher. Okay, next, I believe, do we have the next questions in the Facebook? If I'm not mistaken, yeah. How do we strike a balance in providing our students with fixed menu of module and courses for their programs that we think are useful for them? I like that we think are useful for them, and giving them the freedom to choose bit-sized one. Wow.
Well, that is a really, really complex challenge, because there is a value, like, we need experts, right? Like, we've found that, especially in COVID, we need experts, we need researchers, we need people who understand the topic that they're learning. And we found, especially in some parts of the world, where we have people with opinions on social media that people are listening to rather than experts. And so we have that in all areas. We have experts in religious studies. We have experts in medical science. We have experts in pedagogy. So I think there's a tough question here that leaders, school leaders, and other professors need to think about, which is, we want to activate the latent knowledge capacity of our students. However, if we don't do a good job of giving them the insight to interact, or the ability to interact with experts, to understand the role of expertise, then I think we're doing them a disservice, because what's going to happen is these individuals go out and they're going to end up needing support. They're going to end up needing to know when they don't know things. And so one of the things I worry about a little bit is, while I think it's fantastic that we're shifting to networks, we're giving individuals control, I think it's disconcerting that that control is being done at the expense of expertise, and almost where we're diminishing expertise in a lot of areas. So we're mistaking, a loudmouth with a lot of followers on social media with an expert who has spent 30 years of her life developing capabilities in an area. And that's what worries me in general in society, and also worries me in the university system. So I think we need to teach our students, or give them the skills when they're connecting different sources of information, to understand things like bias, their own bias, the bias of others. They need to understand what is the role of expertise, and when is expertise more important than their own opinion, and so on. And so getting them to walk that fine line between networks and self-control and self-regulation versus respect for expertise and the outcomes that have existed, for 20, 30, 40, 100, 200 years, because experts have built that knowledge up sequentially.
Yeah. Okay. And I never believe the expert is one of us is professors. We are the experts, and we need to actually, how we can actually persuade them that we are still relevant in higher eds, with all the online informations around our students. Okay, the next one, we have the next question. I saw one. Yeah. Since there is such thing as competency based study, do you envision that maybe the social media, the Web 2.0, such as Facebook, be a platform for people to obtain their official competency? Because there are many people in Facebook and other social medias, or will you see university join forces with social media in terms of platform establishment?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I do think that there are ways that we should be able to use social media or networks of peer production. I think that's an important point. It's not just networks, it's networks where we're creating artifacts. And I think in my second last slide, I addressed that a little bit today. But we have to create something. We have to create content, resources, or insight in order for that to have the kind of impact that we feel is going to be most critical in a number of domain areas. So I emphasize that because we want to promote the understanding or the insights that can come from these kinds of systems. We want formal recognition, but we also know that our classrooms are quite ineffective for some students. They're useful at certain stages. Quite often, I would think at the start of learning something new, it's nice to be able to meet physically. But even now, I'm finding, having spent a lot of my career online, and certainly over the last probably 2 years with just conference travel and then with COVID, there's very rarely is there a need to have a physical meeting to get together in a room for a discussion. I think so much can be done online, and often what's happening online is so much more effective as a meeting mechanism than in person. The same holds true. Like, why shouldn't universities leverage or take advantage of some of the social media platforms that allows students to create and to share resources and content that they've created, or to take what someone else has done, make it better, improve it, and then share that onward as well. So I think those are some of the areas where I don't know if partnering with social media platforms is the path forward, but I do know some way of thinking more effectively as a school or university system around the power of networks. The power of everyone being involved as an active creator is a really important aspect to think about.
Yeah. Thank you, Josh. Okay, do we have other questions from Facebook and YouTube? Okay, that's one question. How to convince our colleagues to transform the conventional assessment to better ways of alternative assessment that effectively evaluate the learner's competency during our emergency remote teaching now?
Well, I think the assessment one is a difficult one, because really, if you look at, there's three big things that go on in the university or the school experience. One is teaching, the second is learning, and then the third is the assessment or the evaluation. They're all distinct. So teaching has changed a lot, because we can now learn, and teaching and learning are intertwined, but we can teach one another. We can learn from courses that someone has taught. Let's say you're taking statistics at a course, and it's a tough course, and then over time, we will find a better way to improve the quality of that kind of interaction. But I think what needs to happen is we need to do a better job of understanding where learning fails in this kind of a setting. And by this setting, I mean, where we have the structured teaching that we then pass off to students to learn on their own. How do we do a better job of articulating that and making that happen? There's the self-regulated learning. Students now have access to an incredible amount of resources that they can, you can Google almost any question and find a couple of good YouTube videos, or if you want something more focused, you can go to Coursera and take a course on that platform. And so there's a number of really promising avenues of interaction that exist in those spaces. The same holds true when you start to talk about a number of the opportunities or the avenues that exist for Khan Academy, for peer-based teaching systems, and so on. So teaching and learning have largely been digitized and rendered to networks. We can still go to a classroom, but if you can give someone a course and say, hey, we're learning this topic, chances are they can find pieces of that curriculum online and in many ways teach themselves much of that. The assessment part, though, is hard because that's something that we haven't done a good job of moving to digital networks yet. We've done peer-based assessment. I know some of the MOOC providers have tried peer-based assessment, but ultimately assessment is still the one area that has been underdeveloped. Developing alternative assessment mechanisms, it takes time. It takes skills on the part of the individual teacher. And I think there is a professional development problem to answer this question more than anything else. People, if they know how to assess in a more innovative way, they might consider it. But I think a lot of teachers have been traditionally taught and trained, and they're not aware of what alternative assessments might look like. They're not aware of the options that exist. And so I think that's one of the reasons why that's such a big challenge.
Okay, thank you, Josh. I think we can move to the last subsection, which is actually looking forwards on the futures of connectivism and also the futures of online learning. Okay, Josh, the floor is yours. Okay. I think you muted, Josh.
I'm used to Zoom where I can see exactly where my button is, but once I start sharing,
Yeah.
once I start sharing my slides, then my microphone button is gone, so I don't see that I'm muted.
Yeah.
Anyway, so one of the things I'm going to talk about this fairly quickly. There's a number of slides. I'll move through them quickly. There's actually a lot more slides than the time. So I think there's about 15 to 20 slides that I'll move through quickly to get at this the way that these things are interconnected and what that might look like from a learning lens. So first of all, this is really the simplest model that I can say that we need to do for the future of schooling. One, the knowledge of the learner that's developed through formal and informal learning. It doesn't matter schools, it doesn't matter you learn on your own, where you formally taught. Then there's a second domain, which is the architecture of a discipline. And so that could be, what do you need to know to be a teacher? What do you need to know to be a nurse, to be an engineer, to be a doctor? And so what we want to do is we want to assess what you know as a student, what do you need to know to get a degree, and then the formal recognition or a degree. The difficulty here is that the assessment is the key issue here, right? Between the learner knowledge and the architecture of a discipline is an assessment problem or an assessment question. How do we assess what somebody knows in relation to that? And if a student knows what they need to know, then we look at this idea of, can we grant them a degree or a diploma? Now, I would say, especially learner knowledge, we can increasingly do that on our own or through a range of online tools and mechanisms. And so where I look at here is I've turned my attention much more to learning analytics and to the idea of adaptive learning. So let's start, generally speaking, that learning has a number of attributes that are involved. There's the cognitive aspect, which is what are we learning? There's the process and strategy dimension, which is metacognition, I guess would be another word, but how do we engage in that, or how do we learn and move forward in that regard? Then there is the affective aspect, which is, our general interactions, emotive and so on as we're involved. And then there's the social dynamics and how we're involved. So ultimately, the whole point of this system is it's learning. We want to emphasize learning. Now, there's a number of supporting structures that sit on top of this. So there's the technology that we have access to. If you have an LMS, if you have social media tools, like the question just now about should we partner with these major social media platforms. We also have, and this is a key area of interest for me, but we have growing quantities of data available, which is being produced as individuals learn and as they engage in online settings. And then we have the need to develop people and to develop the skills of our teachers, but also to develop our students' ability to self-regulate. When is it a trustworthy source? When should you stop and reflect before just simply adopting it? What are some of your own biases? Maybe you heard something that you really agree with, and you didn't agree with it because it's a good point, but you agreed with it because it just kind of made sense to you. And so these enabling systems then involve next generation technologies, human and machine interactions, a group of data sources from about standards on working with data, learning analytics models, using wearables or wearable technologies, and developing people that are involved in this system, including developing our students. Now, I emphasize this because this is an enabling layer, which now will sort of drop down, but I just want to be aware that everything that we do with learning and learning innovation requires we attend to the types of tools and technologies we have, the kinds of data that's being generated for analysis and tracking, and then the skill sets of the people that are involved in this. So this will disappear on the subsequent slides, but this is the background that makes the rest of this work. So our goal is learning. We want to improve our students' cognitive, metacognitive, affective, and social attributes of learning. We want to create holistic learners, and that's a key outcome of this. Now, teaching is what we currently do. I mean, that's our primary effect of getting there. We think that when we teach, we're advancing these 4 dimensions of our students. And of course, we are at a number of levels. We do that through a couple of different approaches. We put greater attention onto evaluation and feedback. So particularly we emphasize the value of summative feedback rather than only, formative feedback rather than only summative. We want to give students feedback early enough so that they can continue to improve and become more effective at their learning experience. So there's this relationship between teaching, learning, and evaluation and feedback that we want to pay attention to. Now, the curriculum is an interesting part. That's the material or the content that we're trying to teach. That's related to learning, and these 2 pieces eventually result or produce some type of a profile of our learners. And I would argue, and there's a number of projects, especially with colleagues at the University of South Australia that we're focusing on this, is it's the learner profile that's the key missing piece. Building a profile of our students, particularly around these 4 elements, the cognitive, metacognitive, affective, social, that's a critical issue that we need to address. So the model then is teaching and feedback, working with curriculum, and building profiles of our students. And I'll get to where learner analytics or learning analytics comes in right away, because the future of teaching and learning is to think differently about each of these elements or each of these stages. So learning analytics then comes in and starts to say, how can we do a better job of supporting, developing, and promoting our students as they're involved in this range of processes? How can we use analytics to improve the quality of teaching, evaluating which teaching practices actually have an effect? How can we evaluate what a student is learning and how we can give them more effective, pointed feedback? Is the content that we're using improving student performance, or is it not having the desired scope of effect that we think we need to have in order for them to succeed? How can we use the analytics to develop better profiles? How can we use, looking again at that enabling layer that I listed earlier, how can we use new technologies and data to better evaluate the overall learning strategies and to start to create profiles of our students? And that in turn then relates to how do we use these kinds of data to drive engagement, because it's engagement that ultimately determines whether a student is active or involved. And this is where things like detectors come in. So detectors are where we use some aspect of data and the data process to be able to provide a meaningful insight into the overall learning experience or learning outcome. So we make this connection between engagement through to detectors, and ultimately that is the kind of connection that we then bring back to learning and learning strategy. So the entire point then, and this is the last slide on this particular area, but the point is that learning analytics has a central role in monitoring this entire scope of influence, from the teaching to the evaluation to content to profile development and to building models that allow us to determine whether students are actually advancing in terms of a learning lens the way that we think they should be. Now, a couple of quick slides. I'm down to about my last 4 slides now, but a couple of quick slides I just want to address. One, this came out of a number of courses that I did with a colleague, Stephen Downs, many years ago, where we started looking at how do we stitch together informal and informal learning in a way that has a meaningful impact, right? How do you take blogs and learning management systems and social media and so on, filter it and produce an adaptive resource, and a resource that has, blogs and micro blogs and alerts for individuals as they engage in this kind of a comment ecosystem, where what we're trying to do, again, as I stated earlier, we're trying to move from the existing model of classroom and classroom structures to a slightly more chaotic network structure where learning analytics starts to become an increasingly important agent. And just to revisit, this was the structure that we've had in the past, where faculty listed the courses. This is what we're going to be doing in terms of curriculum interacting. These are the spaces of learning: classroom, field, lab, work setting. And basically faculty members say, this is what we're doing, these are the guest speakers, this is what's happening, and this is what you'll learn. In a connectivist course, you break a lot of those pieces. Learners produce artifacts that recenter this entire learning experience. They produce outcomes that are completely different than what we necessarily intended or even anticipated. Faculty still share resources. They amplify what's been shared by others. They use a number of different resources and materials, and you learn in a range of different ways, not just what's available in that particular classroom or that particular resource. So the emphasis here is there's still a critical role for the teacher, the educator, but instead what the educator is doing and what learners are doing is they're co-creating the curriculum, or is this co-production of knowledge as part of that key process. So I think that's it for now. I just want to bring up the Master of Science that I mentioned earlier. It's a program that was recently launched. We're doing our second enrollment now for January, in a few months' time. So if anyone's interested, you'll see the URL, either the QR code or just use the URL on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. And I think on that note, I will pause and return it back to you.
Let us observe if we have questions from Facebook and YouTube regarding our last discussion topic. Let us wait. Okay. Okay. Yeah, we have one. How to convince is the cultures of ignorance, traditional is easier, or we really want to change due to the new environments because of the digital COVID?
Yeah, I think it gets a little bit back to here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I think I can do that now. Okay, I think I'm done sharing. I think it gets a little bit. Did I stop?
Yeah. You already stopped sharing your screen.
Did I mute myself? Okay, I think I'm still here.
Yeah,
it looks like I'm freezing up.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think the key issue is what I said earlier, which is we need younger people and more experimental people in the learning process, right? We need individuals that know how to work with new technologies, that have experimented with different tool sets. They're the ones in a number of ways that are going to make those changes happen in classrooms. If you've never worked with a tool or a technology, and if you've never worked with a new whatever platform that you have at your disposal, I think there's a real concern that you won't be able to meet the needs of a student that's going to work in these kinds of networked environments. And you may find it extremely difficult to be able to promote or to have the kind of an impact on their learning. So I think a big part of it is either if you've been in the university for a while or in the academy or in school systems, then my argument would be start learning, keep learning, play with new tools, take courses on new technologies, learn how these tool sets work, and then you'll be able to better understand what's happening. Or the second thing is connect with and partner with your younger peers. Have students co-teach material. They'll have a pretty good way of doing it as well. So there's a number of avenues that I think we can definitely target or identify in this kind of environment as well.
Okay, thank you, George. Do we have other question? Yeah, we have another one. In 30 years or more, do you think that augmented reality and virtual reality may be the most dominant ways of teaching and learning, the competency certifications or certificates, something like that?
I think there will be much more augmented reality or virtual reality. If there's this concept of the metaverse that has been around for many decades, actually. A number of companies, Google or Facebook being amongst the most aggressive, is trying to push this idea of the metaverse. And the metaverse basically is that we will have a coexistence between physical and virtual worlds that are much more harmonious than they are right now, right? Like right now we log on to be online, and the concept of the metaverse is that you're always online, you're always engaging in these digital worlds. So I do think that we'll see more and more of it, but I also think, and in a good way, I think we're going to see more people push back at that. They're going to say, you know what, there's value of being together in person. There's value of not being online all the time. I sometimes make it a goal to kind of do for, people will fast or do diets or something, and sometimes you need to do the same with information. You need to do 5 days where you only read books rather than the internet and all the news on the internet and things like that. So I think there are different ways that we can pay better attention to a number of tools, number of technologies, and so on that are available or are at our disposal. So I do think augmented reality and virtual reality will be more prominent. I don't know if they'll be dominant, but they will definitely be more prominent. I do think as well that a number of organizational leaders will start to see a growing interest in a return to some of the traditional face-to-face values and some of those high quality, high connection experiences.
Yeah. Do we have, the next one, the connectivist course you explained just now is super interesting. I assume the connectivist course could be virtually conducted or hybrid. How can we develop student professional skills such as team working, collaborative, empathy skills, and emotional intelligence?
So, first of all, you're right. It could be either hybrid, or it could be fully online, or it could be in person. Because if you look at it, I mentioned there's 3 dimensions of connectedness when we're involved in connectivist learning. There's the neuronal level where we're actually just learning and engaging and interacting. Then there's the conceptual level, which is where we're connecting ideas. That can happen in person, that can happen online, that could happen in a hybrid format. The skills, though, that you're raising is an important one, because that relates to many cases the external skills, right? At least the team working and the collaborative ones. The empathy skills and the emotional intelligence is critical. We see countries that are having a breakdown of social cohesion produce greater levels of conflict and anger, antagonism, and so on. So I think that element starts to become very consequential. I believe that those skills should be built into really the earliest stages of the education process. And we should give students the ability or the skill sets to be able to understand how they know something, what their approach is to having come to learn something, how can they gain a better insight or better understanding, and the list goes on. So I think it's really important that we emphasize exactly those skills: teamwork, empathy, caring, kindness, compassion, collaboration, working with others, building and creating artifacts, sharing your artifacts, have others use your artifacts to make something better. You use their artifacts to make something better. I think that kind of a relationship between this continuous interaction between creating and consuming what someone else did, create something based on what something else, sharing what you learned back to the group, and then having them improve it, and the list goes on. So I do think that modeling complex social skills can only be learned experientially or by modeling. They can't be learned by instruction, because if you tell someone, be a nice person, George, and have compassion, George, that doesn't quite work. But if I see someone do it, I see someone model it, I'm put in a team setting where I need to exhibit some of those skills, that's when I can start to exhibit that as well.
Okay, thank you, George. Do we have other questions from Facebook and YouTube? Yeah. Problem has always been used to connect learning. Problem-based learning have been implemented for many years. Can current requirements create more urgency to push them to be more prevalent in higher education?
I would hope so, and the reason I would say that is problem-based learning is fantastic. Like you noted, that it's a great way to do connected learning. if you look at a lot of the way that we'll live the rest of our lives outside of universities, unless you're, even if you're a prof, you're always trying to solve complex problems. But the rest of our lives, after we've got our degree, we spend our time in problem solving situations, and our schools and universities should prepare us for it. So I hope there's more urgency there, but I think the missing element is that many of us have been taught this is how you learn. You learn by instruction, you learn by listening to a lecture, you learn by taking notes. If we push those requirements to the side and instead we turn and we say, you know what, we want people to engage in intractable, complex problem solving. We want them to engage in trying to address these difficult kinds of challenges. That's when I do think we're going to see better outcomes and better results, and I think much more creative results as well. So I do hope that we'll see a greater push for problem-based learning.
Yeah, thank you, Josh. We have, I think this is interesting. Another interesting question. How do you like MOOCs today, since their involvement from your C MOOCs?
Well, first of all, it's good to see Zarani again. I thought I actually might have seen you in Kuala Lumpur. I can't remember for sure, but I thought I did. But anyway, it's good to see your name here. So I think it's interesting with MOOCs. On the one hand, they aren't doing what I was hoping they would do, which was they were going to be dynamic, connectivist, collaborative, engaged online learning. Instead, what we have today is instructivist MOOCs. Now, initially I was quite dismissive of them. I thought, I didn't like their approach, I didn't like the model, but now I see students from around the world that didn't have access to learning opportunities. They're now getting access to learning opportunities, and they're having, fantastic experiences. There's young kids in all parts of the world learning technical skills that will prepare them for a complex future. So I think that's my way of saying I wish MOOCs were more collaborative, were more adaptive, focused more on creativity, focused more on students generating and creating new resources, and were less focused on this kind of a instructivist model. However, with that said, I'm quite pleased to see the opportunities that students from around the world have to learn complex topics in a way that gives them access to learning that they just didn't have even a few years ago. So I think that end I'm very pleased about, and I find that in a lot of ways very gratifying to see individuals have opportunities and access to learning they wouldn't have otherwise. However, I would still love it if their access opportunities to learning were more reflective of complex knowledge problems and more reflective of these kinds of opportunities that we need in terms of future skills.
Okay. So do we have, I think, the last question? Can we take it from Facebook or YouTube? Okay, this is going to be our last. The GRI shopper that you presented is very interesting. It leads to command ecosystem that integrates command input from blogs, LMS, Web 2.0, etc. How's the developmental progress of this command ecosystem at the moment? Is there any progress on it?
Well, no, I mean, not much from where, because the core idea is still there. And I think it fits a little bit into this idea that I mentioned earlier, is that we haven't fully absorbed the lessons of Web 2.0 in our education system. And I think in the same regard, the whole point of Grasshopper, which was a tool that Stephen Downes built, but it was based on just a number of solid Web 2.0 concepts, which is that, we do a better job of filtering and processing information. I think today, if somebody were to take and build it and develop it, it would be centrally founded on general AI principles, where we would say that Grasshopper or that ecosystem, its primary role is to do ongoing complex analysis of the needs of individual students in such a way that can give them sort of deep learning and deep insights into their ongoing learning needs. And the reason I think that's so important is that that's precisely the challenge that we face in most of our school systems now, is how do you make better use of technologies that can help us think? So it gets back to the AI question that I started with, and by help us think, I'm referring to any number of tool technologies that are active cognitive agents. So while Grasshopper the core idea of content from a lot of sources integrated into one source, then pushed out into a single format to be shared by others, that is then produced as an artifact for conversation, that should now be much better managed through AI or through AI technologies. But at this stage, there hasn't been significant development since some of the earlier ideas were created.
Okay, thank you, John. I would like to stop now, but I still receive one or two questions. If we can just answer this one from Prof Karim. CMOOC's model required more commitment, efforts, and time investment by both students and faculty. Would you agree on that?
Yes. Absolutely, they do. And the reason is anytime you do something that's a richer experience, it's going to take more time and effort. It's like going to the library has very low effort costs. You take a book down from the shelf and you read it. Going to university and learning how to understand a core concept in physics takes time and effort and investment from the student and the teacher. The problem that I think we're seeing, and this is an insightful point that's being made here, is that the current approach is we don't have the skills and the capabilities on the educators, and a lot of our students are kind of in a rush because they're used to living in a quick soundbite world rather than a more focused, coherent knowledge domain, which is, I think, the key goal that we want to get to.
Okay, thank you, Josh. Okay, I think we reach up to the end of the session. Thank you very much, Josh, for answering all those questions. I think, I believe some thought point that have been shared by Josh has actually an eye opener to all of us. If we would like to stay relevant as an experts in higher eds, we need to actually explore on the future learnings. And it's not future anymore, it's the future is now. For me, the future is now. There is one, I think, from Prof Rose Alinda. Can you just put it back? I think that's a remark. Or AI infused classroom and one of the way forwards. That's another remarks by our professors at UTM. Our Professor Rose Alinda is one of the AI expert, and she actually can. Then we can see that how do we combine the AI, the neuroscience, and the cognitive learning. Because I did remember in 1998, I learned a lot on neuroscience part. At that moment, we did not actually integrate it with the AI, what I call it, architectures and the concept for learning from the AI perspective. So thank you very much, Josh, for actually having the session with all of us today. I believe we will invite you in the future to talk about other things about connectivism and the way forwards of our higher eds and online learning, so that we still can be relevant to our students outside there, and to those students who might be joining us to Facebook and YouTube. Now you can see that you need to explore your latent knowledge capacity, okay, and make sure that you will actually explore your capability and you be active in your own learning. So I would like to wrap up the presentations with several important points to all of us. Okay, first of all, it's clear that technology is changing how student learning and out of the classroom. Rather than learning from teachers and textbook, smartphones, laptop, connectivity resources serve as a hub of information for today's students. And this is, I believe, most of the students agree on it. The increasing use of technology as an educational tool has changed the learning landscape, including the Malaysian higher education landscape. We reclaim gaps in traditional ideas of teaching and the needs of new methods to keep up. And learning is the process of connecting. And with all the tools that we have around us, it make the students they can connect easily with others, with the other expert, with other students around the world. And students or learners are agent for their own learning. For those students who actually are together with us in YouTube and Facebook, you have to remember you are agent for your own learning and personal developments. Therefore, to all our students there, you are actually, I believe you are our friends, and you have to take in charge of your own learning. And we, as your friends, will love to guide you to success in achieving your dreams. And to all professors out there, we can be categorized as expert where we need to explore and activate the latent knowledge capacity of our students. So together, we strive for the best, and I believe Academy of Professors Malaysia is always there to assist everybody. So ladies and gentlemen, before I end, what I call it, our sessions today, I would like to remind all of you to like our Facebook, Malaysian Higher Education 4.0 Facebook, and also our Academy of Professor Malaysia YouTube. More event like webinar will come in later on in the futures, and in teaching in 2030 will not be shaped by technologies only. The curriculum modifications and the new practices that need to be explored by all of us. And this is where I believe together, we are the professors in the Academy of Professor Malaysia, and all of our colleagues and friends out there. Please join our Academy of Professor Malaysia, where we together we will make the world better. So with that, we will end our session with the video of Academy of Professor Malaysia. With that, I would like to say thank you. Assalamualaikum. See you again in the next webinar series that will be organized by Education and Human Development Cluster, Academy of Professor Malaysia, and the Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities, UTM. With that, I end with wabillahi taufiq wa hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh.